We are just going to wait a moment or two until Zoom finishes populating. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? So this session is being recorded. Welcome to the CBITs Digital Mental Health webinar in collaboration with the Society for Digital Mental Health. I just have a couple of announcements before we begin. So the Society for Digital Mental Health will be holding its inaugural conference June 13th and 14th. It'll be held remotely, so it'll be 2 half days, and the submission portal is open for poster and flash talk submissions. I'll share that link in a moment with you in the chat. In addition to the meeting, at that meeting, in addition to the talks, we'll be putting together work groups to develop, as part of the society, policy briefs and best practices guidelines. So we would welcome anybody who wants to get involved in trying to move digital mental health as a treatment option forward in the American healthcare system. We would welcome your involvement. And joining the society is free, and you'll get then updates about activities. So now to our guest speaker, Aaron Lyon. So welcome, Aaron. Aaron is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Washington, but what makes him, I think, unusual, he's trained as a clinical psychologist, but what makes him, I think, somewhat unusual is that he also has a certificate in user-centered design from the University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering department. He is also director of the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training, or SMART Center, where they focus on implementation research, technical assistance. I'm going to skip that. My notes are a mess. So anyway, his research focuses on increasing the accessibility and efficiency and effectiveness of community and school-based interventions for children, adolescents, and families. His work has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Justice, the Institute of Education Sciences, and lots of different foundations. So I am looking forward to this talk. Also, as he's speaking, you can add questions into the Q&A button, and we will read them off, or Andrea here on the screen will read them off when we're finished. So thank you. Aaron.
Thanks so much, David. Happy to be here. Let me share my screen. Just give me a thumbs up if you see what you think you should see.
Yes, you're good.
So I'm happy to be here kind of in multiple hats. As one of the directors of the SMART Center, which I co-direct with Jill Locke, and Eric Bruns is also an associate director of the SMART Center. Also, in my role as co-director of the UW ALACRITY Center, funded by NIMH, which I lead with Sean Munson and Pat Arian. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is adaptation and how we can do adaptation better. Adaptation of a lot of different things. Psychosocial interventions, complex implementation strategies, digital technologies. And I know that this is a digital technology group first and foremost. And I want to make sure that I make the point that, say at the UW ALACRITY Center, we consider digital redesign to be sort of one really important category of redesign solution among the many options available. The majority of our projects at the UW ALACRITY Center have a digital component, or even sort of more fully digital than that. But many do not. And what I'm going to be talking about a lot today are all the different kinds of ways that human-centered design methods can be applied in order to create better things, and that those things may be client-facing, practitioner-facing, or consumer-facing. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement that we at the University of Washington Smart Center and ALACRITY Center acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. And we're grateful to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. A couple other acknowledgements, just some funding for related work that I'll be at least touching on from NIMH and from IES, the Institute of Education Sciences. And I'm going to start at the end with the main points and main sort of conclusions of what I'll be talking about today. The first is that the world is designed and can be better designed. I feel like people who sit in the digital space tend to know that and be kind of more proximal to some of these methods and aware of them than those when I'm talking to people who sit sort of primarily in psychosocial intervention development and who are sort of designing or implementing psychotherapies. So I feel like often you all have a little bit of a leg up when talking about these things, or have done kind of user testing informed by human-centered design methods when developing apps or other digital technologies. The human-centered design and implementation science have overlapping objectives. Those are sort of the two main worlds that I sit in, but different foci, and I'll talk a little about that. And that there's opportunities to better integrate the two surrounding the incorporation of things like stakeholder perspectives and collaborative redesigns of interventions, regardless of whether those interventions are psychosocial, digital, or somewhere in between. First, I'd like to talk about how design problems are everywhere. This is a classic example of bad design. A door, something as simple as a door that needs a workaround with a sign to tell you how to use it. If you need a sign to tell you how to use a door, maybe it's not a very well-designed door. Taking your eyes off the road too long or too often could cause a crash, resulting in injury or death for you or others. Focus your attention on driving, and oh yes, hopefully you're still alive by the time you're done reading. Here's a classic one. It's a well-known fact that you must spin a USB 3 times. Therefore, we can deduce that a USB has 3 states: the up position, down position, and the superposition. And it will remain in the superposition until observed, except in cases of USB tunneling. This is another sort of classic example that those sort of in the design community like to, at least historically, before we had USB-C, bring out as an example of almost a seemingly ubiquitous problematic design. I've used the term human-centered design, but I want to acknowledge that there are lots of other terms that can be applied to these sort of methods, this sort of approach, and a lot of these frameworks, including things like co-design, user interface, human-computer interaction, user experience, design thinking, user-centered design, human factors engineering. Some people will argue very passionately about which one is the larger umbrella term. I'm not here to weigh in on that at all. We use the term human-centered design most often at the UW ALACRITY Center. This is similar in a lot of ways to implementation science, where we have implementation science, knowledge translation, knowledge utilization, scaling science, and the list there goes on and on too. So there's a real parallel there. But regardless, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. This is a generic overview of sort of a human-centered design model. And most have these components, right? Where you begin identifying a need, begin to understand and specify the context of use, specify users and user contextual requirements, develop redesigned solutions to meet those requirements, evaluate your solutions against the requirements, do this iteratively until you meet the contextual and user requirements that you've laid out. All of this really relies on building an understanding and empathy for the people in the real world who are going to be using a given product. And that's why human-centered design is really intended to be an approach that grounds this product development process in the people and settings where it's going to be used. I spend a lot of time in the implementation space. So I spent a lot of time thinking about human-centered design and implementation science and how they are aligned, misaligned, what are their unique contributions. In general, and none of these are hard and fast rules, I would say that HCD and implementation science share a focus on the adoption of new innovations, getting things out there to the people who could benefit from them, and doing so sort of through a process of iteratively solving real world problems and incorporating the perspectives of multiple stakeholders and focusing ultimately on individual behavior. But they go about it kind of differently. Human-centered design is much more likely to change the innovation to meet local needs, whereas implementation science has at least a historical perspective where innovation fidelity and delivery with fidelity is held up as a very powerful ideal. Human-centered design evaluates, but I would argue rarely changes the settings in which for which things are being designed directly. Often considers very carefully kind of the context of use and tries to develop something that's going to fit that even better. Whereas implementation science very frequently is about organizations, changing organizations, influencing the setting in order to ensure that it's more conducive to a new innovation. A lot of this is also contained in a great paper that came out a year or two ago by Chen et al. Talking about the interface of human-centered design and implementation science. These are some similar points were made to what I was just talking about, and they really focused on implementation science contributing these broad multi-level frameworks. We have a lot of frameworks in implementation science, if you didn't know, and human-centered design contributing specific user-focused methods. This was a useful paper that Alex Dopp led that detailed 30 human-centered design strategies for people who do a lot of work in implementation science. These human-centered design strategies covered different system levels and included those that were attending to the innovation level and those that attended to the innovation level. Like the thing that might be implemented were more common within human-centered design, user-centered design than within implementation, where sometimes we default to thinking about an innovation as something relatively static. So there's a lot of opportunity here for overlap and integration. But how integrated are human-centered design and implementation science? Some other work led by Alex Dopp also completed an online study of experts in both fields and completed a concept mapping task of those 30 human-centered design strategies, and also a subset of the popular ERIC compilation of implementation strategies to try to identify distinct clusters, and came up with a final selected set of 10 clusters in order to sort of begin to look at the degree of alignment across core practices. And in the end, we see that they're not particularly well aligned or overlapping. And there's different ways of thinking about this. This may be a positive because there's a lot of opportunity for unique contributions, because we only have 3 of 10 strategies that were sort of truly transdisciplinary. There are 5 implementation only clusters, those are at the top, and 2 HCD only clusters, and those were at the bottom right. And you can see are actually relatively tightly clustered together relative to some of the further sort of broad-reaching implementation strategies. So there's opportunities. There's opportunities for alignment. There's opportunities for complementarity, and some of that's what I'll be talking about today. When I think of human-centered design and targets in implementation, I think of at least 3 different things. This was in a paper where we kind of referred to them as different health services research products. We have evidence-based psychosocial interventions, right? These are psychotherapies, these are parent training protocols, cognitive behavioral therapy, things like that. These complex processes that are part of intervention or are the entirety of intervention. We have digital technologies, right? Broad range of technologies that can support users in changing behaviors and cognitions, right? These could be devices and wearables, these could be apps, et cetera. And then also implementation strategies, the methods or techniques to enhance the adoption, implementation, and sustainment of programs or practices or technologies for that matter, right? So these could be things like leadership-oriented trainings and supports, like the pretty popular loci intervention, leadership for organizational change and implementation, spearheaded by Greg Ahrens and Mark Earhart. It could be straightforward initial training or post-training consultation to sort of cornerstone implementation strategies. It's interesting, in a couple of reviews, one systematic, one narrative, focusing on the health space and the education space and the application of human-centered design methods. They've really those reviews have really shown, one's by Altman et al., one's by Ninachilio et al., both published actually in 2018, have both showed that non-digital applications remain relatively rare, that the majority of the human-centered design work that's going on out there, regardless of whether or not it's sort of explicitly focused on implementation, is focused on digital technologies. And that's well and good and very important. I also think that means that there's a lot of opportunity for applications to, let's say, less traditional targets of human-centered design, like our more psychosocial interventions and implementation strategies, regardless of whether or not they have a digital component. When we're talking about interventions and strategies, I think we're often talking about things that suffer from over-design and under-design simultaneously. Over-design for performance in research and under-design for addressing the needs and constraints of routine service contexts. So over-design many of our interventions and implementation strategies, and sometimes our digital technologies, are complicated and infeasible, and not really well aligned with what's going to be easily adopted in the real world. They often require a replacement of existing practices, especially when we're talking about psychotherapies. And these are also under-designed, often inflexible, or at least perceived to be by the users who are ultimately going to be engaging with them, especially, let's say, mental health clinicians who often have a perspective that and this is a valid perspective much of the time, that some psychotherapy protocols are too structured and inflexible. And even the perception that these things are overly structured or inflexible, I would argue, is itself a design problem. And the reason all of this matters is because problematic design limits scalability. We know that the public health impact of our interventions continues to be limited by inconsistent application in community context. I think this is also true for some of our increasingly evidence-based digital technologies and apps. And this is kind of where implementation science comes in, the study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings into routine practice. And I would argue that EDPI, implementation strategy, digital technology design is an underappreciated determinant. And by determinant, I mean barrier or facilitator, but here we're really talking about barrier of adoption and use. And this is where I start to think about adaptation and taking the really high quality things that we have, regardless of their modality, and figuring out how they can be better designed, how they can be adapted to meet local contexts, and to be more really implementable. It's a great quote from a paper, Greg Ahrens, that I think really captures a lot of this. For all types of scaling out, it may be possible to use the identical evidence-based intervention. However, we more often need to adapt the intervention to fit the new population and/or new delivery system. And this isn't a new idea within implementation science. This is the sort of really well-known CFIR model, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, that even in its sort of core figure makes really clear that there is no implementation without adaptation, that sort of through the process of implementation, you're going to have an adapted intervention come out the other side. Now, we often say that this adapted intervention should be adapted based on changes to its adaptable periphery rather than core components. We don't always know what those are with certainty, but that is another ideal. So thinking about adaptation and thinking about how strategies, technologies, client-facing psychosocial interventions can be better designed and can be adapted to new contexts, we come to the framework that we've been using in the UW ALACRITY Center. And this is really just one sort of more specified version of that more generic human-centered design framework that I showed a number of slides back. We call this DDBT, the Discover, Design, Build, Test framework, where we start by learning about the context. Really during Discover, we're learning about three things. And those three things are the setting, the users, and the thing that we're implementing, whether it's a strategy or a technology or an intervention or some hybrid of all of those. And we're learning about that so that we can identify usability issues and move into our iterative design build phase, right? This sort of iterative redesign being a hallmark of human-centered design, and designing redesign solutions, doing some rapid prototyping, and determining how well we can meet we can address the usability issues and meet a lot of those local constraints. And then we go into the test phase. And in the test phase, that's where we're doing sort of a small scale pilot trial, deploying something to the real world rather than maybe introducing it to people in somewhat more contrived or lab-based environments. And this is not the only game in town. There are other frameworks for iterative redesign. In fact, there's one that I was involved in along with David and some other people, the ACTS framework, specifically for technology-enabled services, that also sort of carries that expectation that there's going to be iterative design of different components of what might be going into an implementation or quality improvement effort. I want to have a note here about digital redesign. Like I said, this isn't an either-or decision, of course. And at the UW ALACRITY Center, we use plenty of digital redesign solutions. Half to 2/3 of our projects have a digital component. But what we really try to do is avoid defaulting to digital solutions, because sometimes they can create as many problems as they solve. Obviously, digital redesign can improve the scale and accessibility of services for some, but potentially limit accessibility for others, maybe based on age or other access issues when it comes to technology or internet use. And technologies, digital technologies in mental health or other spaces can also suffer from the same kinds of adoption and sustainment problems that we see in more traditional sort of psychosocial interventions. So again, we really consider digital technologies to be a really important kind of subset of redesign solutions when we're looking to improve care and improve outcomes. As we're doing all this, as I mentioned briefly before when I was going through the DDBT process, we're really focused on usability as one of our kind of core mechanisms of action for how we're creating more implementable interventions. Usability is the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals in a specified context of use. And we think of this really as a key implementation determinant and an upstream determinant of more perceptual and behavioral implementation outcomes, ultimately leading to service outcomes. I think it's also true that usability is not wholly distinct from some of those perceptual implementation outcomes, and that there's this overlap, but we do think of it as a little more a property of the innovation rather than fully the intersection of the innovation with the context. But this is, of course, a spectrum. I have usability here on the spectrum of contextual independence versus dependence, along with some of our kind of more traditional perceptual implementation outcomes, acceptability, feasibility, appropriateness. But I think it's also an open question, just the extent to which these are fully independent constructs, or whether they are going to cluster together in ways that might not require the specific measurement of each of them independently. Regardless, usability's importance tends to increase with scale. When we start small and we engage with a number of highly motivated individuals, usability isn't necessarily as important. In the early years of computing, early adopters like Bill Gates had the motivation and the expertise to work around design problems, to stay at it. And we see this with some of our psychosocial interventions that were designed in academic environments with highly motivated graduate students who were able to work around and design problems. But as we move toward our goal of population impact and large-scale delivery, we're going to see a much more important premium placed on usability and the degree to which people who don't necessarily have the time, motivation, energy, expertise to work around some of these problems coming into play. So one of the things we're trying to do at the UW ALACRITY Center is conduct usability testing of a wide variety of things, drawing a lot from existing methods from human-centered design. I have some best practices here for usability testing, which include identifying end users really explicitly, primary users, those you're really designing for, secondary users, those you can design for as long as it doesn't get in the way of your ability to meet the needs of your primary users, and also negative users. Who are you not designing for? Because when you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. Another best practice is to prioritize components for testing, especially when we're talking about large, complicated innovations. Just in the same way that it's difficult to test all the different functions of, say, a computer operating system, it's often infeasible to test all the components of an intervention or implementation strategy, or even some of our digital technologies as well. So they need to be prioritized to determine what's going to be most important to get people sort of experiences with. Testing authentic versus ideal circumstances, because we're of course looking for generalizability and a focus on the real world. Creating opportunities for users to interact with components, interacting as directly as possible with different components, and trying it out and trying to apply these things, whether it's in sort of a somewhat contrived scenario or out in the real world. Tracking user success or failure, as well as efficiency while completing tasks, and then qualitatively describing the issues that users encounter, so you can sort of figure out the why for the how right above of task success or failure. I also have this note that focus groups are not usability testing. Focus groups are super important to gather information about individuals and contexts, but they're not usability testing, and they're not going to lead to the same kind of usability problem articulation that we're trying to do, that you can get from sort of a more hands-on approach. Now, there's a lot of different methods to get to sort of something that might be considered usability testing, ranging from, and these are kind of an increasing order of cost and complexity. Simple quantitative instruments, things like for digital technologies, the system usability scale, which has been used for decades. We have some adaptations of the system usability scale that we use for psychosocial interventions and implementation strategies, heuristic evaluation, cognitive walkthroughs, lab-based testing, kind of a hallmark of usability testing in a lot of ways, where you're trying to figure out what specific usability issues do users, either those who are new or more experienced users, encounter when completing targeted activities, and in vivo testing, out in the real world. I want to walk briefly through a method here that we developed for doing usability testing with complex psychosocial interventions like psychotherapies, things like exposure protocols, and that was one example that we put in this paper, was application of this method to an exposure protocol for anxiety. And you see the different sort of steps and components that I was talking about kind of laid out here as explicitly as possible. And apologies if this is a little small, but you can find it in a paper in Implementation, Research, and Practice. There's user identification, and that sort of narrowing from this over-inclusive list of primary users to what are the most important characteristics? What do they need to have already had exposure to, perhaps, if anything, when they come in? Or are we designing something that's going to be able to be picked up by someone who has really little to no experience or expertise in this particular domain? Prioritizing main user groups and then selecting those typical or representative users. Often we think of primary users at this point for something like an intervention, like a psychosocial intervention, being the deliverers and the recipients at the very least. Now, sometimes that's not, that doesn't translate to some digital technologies, which are more likely to be direct to consumer, and there may only be one primary user type in that kind of situation. Then moving on to defining components of interventions. And we like to break down interventions into both task and packaging components. Tasks include content elements, maybe it's psychoeducation, maybe it's exposure, as well as the structures that help to organize those, any treatment algorithms or the use of measurement-based care in order to make decisions about the delivery of those content elements. And then the packaging components, these artifacts, digital or visual materials and handouts and things like that, or manuals, as well as parameters. These often sort of unspoken assumptions about how things are delivered, which include everything from its language to modality to the number of sessions. Sometimes those are well articulated and sometimes they aren't. But these are all things that can be tested and things that can be perhaps better designed if there are problems. So then planning and conducting the tests using an array of different sort of sub-methods that I was showing on the other slide, and coming out of that usability kind of overall, if you're doing heuristic evaluation, you might have adherence to design principles, which can be very helpful in a relatively efficient way to figure out where usability issues might exist. And then we're organizing and prioritizing usability issues. And there's a number of different ways to do that. I'm going to skip through this and talk in a little bit about how we're doing it in the UW ALACRITY Center. So that was for interventions. We also have a method, it's a little bit more of a focus method, the cognitive walkthrough for implementation strategies. And we've applied this recently to a digitally facilitated post-training consultation strategy for measurement-based care. Again, post-training consultation kind of being a cornerstone implementation strategy for a lot of the work that we do, especially within mental and behavioral health. And we've also applied it, and we're in the process of applying it right now, to a leadership-focused strategy to improve implementation climate. This is actually an adaptation of the LOCI strategy, Leadership for Organizational Change and Implementation, that I mentioned earlier. So as applied to a consultation strategy, this is in a project that was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, where we first iteratively developed an online training. And this was pre-COVID. So in some ways, some of this feels a little quaint right now, but an online training for measurement-based care for school-based mental health clinicians. And then knowing that post-training consultation is a cornerstone implementation strategy and would be necessary after that, we also did iterative development and testing of our post-training consultation. And this post-training consultation strategy included weekly use of a digital asynchronous message board to support knowledge gains and accountability, as well as live bi-weekly calls facilitated by, at this point, I can't even remember which platform, but it probably wasn't Zoom at that point, to discuss cases, solidify skills, and promote application of measurement-based care practices. So we applied this to refine that training protocol, that post-training consultation protocol, with a relatively small number of users. And I think that that's an important thing to consider when doing various forms of HCD-driven usability evaluation, is that you can get a lot of information out of just a few people. There's a lot of debate, and has been for decades now, I think, about how many users are actually required in order to make sure that you're identifying the usability issues in a given product. I think the jury's certainly still out when we're talking about complex psychosocial innovations, but sometimes as few as 4 or 5 users can yield some really incredibly useful and powerful insights into how well something is perceived by its users. So we did this group walkthrough procedure with 10 school-based clinicians who generally look like school-based mental health clinicians tend to look. So predominantly female, predominantly white, some of them newer, some of them with more experience under the belts. So here, we just determined necessary preconditions. That was that clinicians had delivered mental health services in a specific context and had also completed the online training that we had also developed. We conducted a hierarchical, it's step number 2 of Swiss, task analysis, and identified 24 different consultation tasks, including things like present one measurement-based care case. There's all sorts of different tasks, and we try to get as specific as we can when we're identifying the different tasks that are required required within something like an implementation strategy, because then we move on to task prioritization, and we have members of the team independently rate on a scale from 1 to 5 each task for its importance and sort of criticality to the success of the implementation strategy, as well as likelihood of errors. Then we turned tasks into different scenarios, and I'll show you just sort of the way we did that with one example on the next slide, and took these scenarios into group testing with representative users. And in this, there's a balance here between how hands-on SWIS can be and how feasible it is. And we try to think of this as a really pragmatic evaluation approach. So we lean a little bit more toward feasibility rather than sort of experience with direct experience with an implementation strategy or its components in the real world. So the way this works is that we pull together a small group of users, like 4 to 5 users. We present a scenario, and we have people indicate how their anticipated likelihood of knowing what to do, doing it, and knowing if they did it correctly. And then after everyone's done those individual ratings and anchored themselves, we have them go around and sort of provide their rationales for their ratings. And a lot of that is where we begin to get the sort of rich qualitative information that we can use to identify usability issues. And that's what we do next, where we articulate usability issues from that information and then categorize them. So here's just one example of one of the scenarios and the tasks that fit within that scenario in this application of SWIS. It's your second consultation call 4 weeks after the initial online training, and you've been applying measurement-based care with multiple students on your caseload. Prior to the call, you're informed that all trainees will need to give an additional case presentation. Again, focused on the use of measurement-based practices with one of your students. So task 1 was to select a case and describe the results of the initial administration of the standardized assessment, et cetera. The second task was, based on the student's intervention goals, briefly describe the rationale for ongoing assessments and how you defined operationalized what a positive intervention response would look like, and your next steps for MBC with that student. So they're not actually doing all of this in those groups, but they are kind of projecting themselves into these scenarios and these tasks and indicating where they think they might run into trouble. And we're doing all of this in service of identifying usability issues, these aspects of the innovation or demands on the user that make it unpleasant, inefficient, onerous, or impossible for the user to achieve their goals. At the UW ALACRITY Center, we've laid out some specific components of a usability issue that we have all the different projects in the center, 15 different projects use in order to report to us in the methods core what they're finding, right? So first we have a description or problem statement, sort of what's the issue. And in these problem statements, we're hoping that the reader would understand when the problem occurs, with what components of the intervention the problem occurs, for which users the problem occurs, what the problem is, and what are its consequences. And then we gather some more quantitative information about their assessment of how bad those consequences are, ranging from catastrophic to a subtle problem that could be fairly readily ignored. There's scope, how often does it happen, right? So is it happening all the time? Is it happening for all users? Is it happening in all components of the thing being evaluated? Or is it more circumscribed than that? Complexity, do we understand the cause of it? And do we understand its fix? Higher complexity issues don't necessarily have easy fixes. And then what evidence supports these above components? So far in the ALACRITY Center, we have identified 72 discrete intervention usability issues across 10 of our studies. We still have some more information coming in from some other study, but these are kind of color-coded by project. So you see there's a range in terms of the number of usability issues identified by a given project. And part of what we are really hoping to learn and have been learning is how much information and how sort of many usability issues might come from one single study. And so there's a lot of variability. Here's an example of a usability issue from a project led by Karen Bears and Jill Locke. This project was one of our sort of pilot RO3 style projects at the UW ALACRITY Center. And it was redesigning a parenting program for children with autism. And they were redesigning it for delivery by teachers in schools in sort of self-contained special education classrooms. The description: individualized visual supports, a core component of this intervention, required a lot of time to develop. The severity was a level 2, that it caused significant delay and frustration. It was a 7 of 8 in terms of scope, in terms of the number of teachers who participated in user testing who experienced this issue. It was fairly low complexity because they had a clear pathway forward and way to address it. And this all came from in-class observations of Ruby and semi-structured interviews to identify and elaborate the usability issue. So it's just like a few caveats. I mean, some teams have struggled, not necessarily this team, but some teams have struggled to articulate usability problems as being issues with the intervention or the implementation strategy. I think there's a pull when writing these kinds of things to do a lot of user blaming and to be like, people don't know how to do this, they're using it wrong, they don't understand. And we try to refocus those in consultation with them in the UW ALACRITY Methods Core to bring the focus back on the thing. And how is it not meeting their needs? How are they insufficiently prepared? How is it insufficiently clear about what they're supposed to be doing? How is it misaligned with their context and their needs in their context? So in some circumstances, we needed to conduct sort of multiple iterations, which can slow research timelines as people were identifying this and identifying all of this. But overall, I think our projects identified that they could conduct usability testing fairly quickly. And that doing so early on, of course, is very useful in preventing the need for downstream changes once things are fully developed or deployed. So across all the different usability issues that we got so far, we've identified, and this is an under review paper led by Sean Munson, 12 different categories of usability issues that we're also working on turning into heuristics. The first is that they're cognitive complex or cognitively overwhelming, right? That the intervention or implementation strategy with or without a digital component is too overwhelming for the interventionist to be able to sort of grapple with adequately. That the time required, it exceeds time available. That the intervention or implementation strategy places excessive demands more than time available. And this could be either within for a psychosocial intervention within session or between sessions for what it kind of requires in terms of preparation. This is a little bit different than the standard implementation barrier of time. Like, I don't have time to do this. This is a little bit different because there are specific demands either within or between session or delivery opportunities for implementation strategies where there might be too much time required by the innovation itself. Incompatibility with interventionist preferences or practices. So the intervention or strategy isn't compatible with how they work, how they've been trained to work, and their sort of existing skills. Incompatibility with workflows, that it's misaligned with their sort of sequencing of work and tasks throughout their day. Insufficient customization to clients or recipients. And this is, of course, a double-edged sword, right? Customization and flexibility is always a bit of a double-edged sword because it can often create additional complexities. But it can also be a real barrier, especially when you're transporting effective innovations from one setting to another. Intervention buy-in or value, that these innovations aren't sufficiently building client or recipient buy-in for its value, because remember, sometimes it's clients if these are client-facing interventions, or sometimes it's sort of recipients of implementation strategies, which could be practitioners working in a particular context. Interventionist buy-in or trust. Over-reliance on technology. We did have a number of projects that had sort of an overemphasis or expectation that there were particular technologies available, and that created its own barrier, even though I think the original intent was that they were going to that it was going to reduce a lot of these implementation barriers and increase scalability. requires unavailable sort of system infrastructure, like physical, systemic, organizational infrastructure that's not available. One example was an intervention that had some assumptions about a particular school having what's known as MTSS, sort of multi-tiered systems of support, which is really an educationally focused version of kind of the classic public health model of universal, selected, and indicated interventions. But without that, the intervention was not nearly as usable because it wasn't able to align with sort of existing structures for identifying kids and kind of moving them to higher levels of intervention. Inadequate scaffolding for the client or the recipient to kind of engage with the intervention, and might need to be either redesigned and simplified, or there might need to be additional supports in order to make that possible. Inadequate training and scaffolding for the interventionist, and lack of support for necessary communication between largely between interventionist and client and recipient. So that's sort of a broad overview of the kinds of things that we're getting. And again, we're hoping to be able to turn these into some heuristics that then sort of can begin to serve as guideposts for good design. And there's certainly heuristics out there, especially for the development of digital technologies, and there have been for decades. And we're trying to put these together as some guidance ultimately for how we can better design these sort of complex implementation strategies and interventions, regardless of whether or not they have a digital component. So back to the main points. The world is designed and we can do better. And there's a lot of opportunity to integrate HCD and implementation science through stakeholder perspectives, redesign of all the things. Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Thank you, Aaron. This was really a great talk, and it's really exciting to see the work that you're doing. And it sounds like I can see that this is going to really benefit the field moving forward. For the audience, please don't hesitate to ask your questions. You can put them in the Q&A. We have about 12 minutes. But I guess while we're waiting for other folks to put this in, I mean, you've outlined like these heuristics at the end, and in a way, what you're trying, these 12 points that you want to turn into heuristics, and they seem like they're really useful kind of constructs for looking at HCD in the context of intervention. And it seems in some ways like a maybe negatively viewed a compendium of potential failure points. And I'm thinking like when you think about HCD, for a technology, there's often kind of an assumption that, this is our goal and we'll figure out some way of doing it. But it seems like when you start looking at integrating that also in implementation, the level of complexity has, just increased dramatically because of the complexity of organizations, as well as the fact then you have, users who are changing and adapting, and what may work one day may, 6 months from them not work. Organizations change. I mean, how mental health care is delivered has changed dramatically over the last 2 years. And I'm wondering, I ask this because we've experienced some failures, and I see a lot of sort of failures in implementation generally. Have you thought about or think about like, when do you draw the line and say this is not solvable? This is like, we have so many issues here. We just need to go back to the drawing board. Our approach is wrong, or is that? I mean, how do you think about sort of? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's hard to have hard and fast rules for when to cut and run.
Yeah. There's no P less than 0.05.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Especially when you're, by the time you figure it out, pretty invested. I mean, part of it is to get information early, obviously, like I was saying about testing early and often, right? Before we're sort of so invested that it's even harder to walk away. So that's certainly one big piece of it. I mean, embracing that failure is the norm failure is more common than success, in my experience, in a lot of these things. Sometimes I'm even like a little surprised when a success comes our way. Maybe I'm just a pessimistic person, but when something actually works, I'm always a little taken aback in a good way. I think just being comfortable with it is, which can be a tall order, is really the name of the game. And as I think that there's also opportunity for taking maybe another page from human-centered design, and when you're putting things together, and if there's opportunities to do things like A/B testing, regardless of sort of what the thing is that you're testing, so that you're going to cast aside one of them ultimately, but that you're going to have a path forward, and it's the better path forward. It's so hard with so much of this to kind of figure out what the right balance is of certainty and appropriate sort of ambiguity or unknown, right? And this comes out when we write grant applications too, and how kind of clear we can be, or what we can anticipate we're going to do versus what the information we get is really going to sort of call us to do. And there's always that sort of sweet spot, and different projects find it differently. I mean, even when you go in, when you put together a proposal, project proposal or grant proposal, and say that we're going to have this digital solution we're going to develop, you've already made a design decision. You hope it's the right one, and you'll probably continue with that because you wrote it into your grant proposal. But just being open to disconfirming information and to maybe take a different tack, right? That's why we try to, as much as we can, and again, it's a balancing act, but to write things or anticipate things where we're laying out clear possible futures, because you can never know.
All right.
Relatedly, I had a question to the review. I can't wait to read it. Some of them, it's awesome how you had people think about them discreetly, but it seems, of course, some of them are, in some respects, maybe higher orders of each other. Like if you don't have buy-in, you probably don't have a lot of the other things below it, so to speak. And how did you help people? You sort of said, okay, what's the top one, or how did you think about some of that?
We didn't necessarily do that. We got all the usability issues that teams could produce or felt were appropriate for them to produce given our common structure. So we didn't make any assumptions about sort of, the sequencing of usability issues or the hierarchical relationship among different usability issues. That might be a sort of subsequent step, but we just sort of tried to describe the landscape with these. And next, we'll also be kind of looking at them and seeing what kinds of redesign solutions came from different categories. So there is that sort of like chronology to it. That's kind of the next, that's the analysis that we're beginning to do right now in order to gather information about how those are linked and whether different types of redesign cluster within those different ones, and then how successful they were.
That'll be great. And now we have some questions coming in, so I'm going to read them because I don't know if you see them, but I'll read them out loud to the group. But that's really helpful, and I'm excited for the next stage of work. And so a question from Andrew Berry is, when determining how to adapt an intervention, an implementation science approach will consider organizational factors. Which adaptations are needed for each particular context? Can implementation science or HCD methods also uncover and address organizational and infrastructural determinants across many interventions? What does this look like? For example, redesigning an EHR system to enable more local customization, or redesigning change management processes to speed up customizations. Thank you, Andrew.
So the question is kind of how, I just found the right tab so I can look at it too, rather than holding it all in my working memory. I mean, I think that within implementation science, there's a lot of kind of contemporary focus on tailoring and tailoring implementation strategies to context. There have been some good papers put out by people like Byron Powell and Kara Lewis, and people who have been thinking a lot about tailoring. So a lot of that is kind of underway. One of the things that I think human-centered design can bring some additional methods that are relevant to that tailoring discussion. And part of it involves, like within our DDBT framework, discover, design, build, test, a lot of that sort of falls into the discover phase and looking and sort of figuring out what those organizational determinants are that are going to drive the redesign of whatever it is that you're going to be introducing into a particular context, and figuring out and trying to prioritize what those characteristics are going to be. And there might be a solution, like a certain degree of customization, either before deployment or allowable customization after the point of deployment for something like an EHR, but that it also applies to any intervention or strategy as well. Could be one way to do that. But trying to figure out, okay, at what level are those decisions made? Essentially is also a design decision. Like, is that a frontline decision? Is that a sort of managerial decision within a given organization? Is that a decision by the team that's introducing this potentially from the outside? So all of those are kind of categories of design decision, I would say, that HCD could be brought to bear on.
Thank you. I'm going to do my best to summarize this next question, which is excellent, from Jonah. Saying that there's some interventions that perform well, small focused RCTs, but then when you go to scale, implementation fails. So, and it's possibly harmful. So what is or should be the bar for testing an intervention in an implementation framework?
What should be the bar for testing intervention and implement? I mean, I don't know if there's any one bar. I mean, of course, this immediately makes me think of, you know, the, at this point, incredibly popular hybrid designs, and, you know, the original paper by Jeff Curran and the updated paper led by Sarah Landis, laying out different types of hybrid trials where you can kind of make a decision about what your priorities would be in a project based on how much evidence, in part, on how much evidence is available for a particular intervention, all with the goal of moving kind of more rapidly toward deploying things and testing them out in the real world and testing them out as they're being implemented as well. So I don't know if that answers this question or not, but I'm all for getting things out there as soon as possible, because we have, you know, whether we still are looking at our 17-year gap for just 14% of original research to find its way into practice, whether we've been able to shorten that in any way, I'm not totally sure. But the more things we can do to accelerate our sort of translational or implementation timeline, the better.
Thank you. And last question, excuse me, I'm curious to hear about how usability relates to long-term engagement and how thinking about long-term engagement factors into HCD.
Great question. One thing we're thinking about a lot within the UW ALACRITY Center is how to conceptualize engagement. And should engagement simply be more, and is more better? Because sometimes more is better, but usually more is not necessarily better in its own right. So I think that sometimes there is a sort of default, whether it's explicitly stated or not, goal in a lot of HCD that like to get to engagement and in a sort of conceptualization of more better, like this sort of quantitative way of thinking about engagement. We're also trying to think about engagement more qualitatively, and to what extent does a particular innovation sort of spark enthusiasm and sort of full participation, even if it's not necessarily more as in more contacts or for a greater duration of time.
All right, I think that brings us just about to the top of the hour, and we actually got through the questions. So, Aaron, I really want to thank you. This was just a tour de force. So I think really useful. And so thank you everybody for coming. Just a reminder, next month, Katie Shilton from the University of Maryland is going to be speaking. She's a computer scientist, and she's going to be talking about privacy management in digital mental health or digital technologies generally. So join us for that. And I believe an upcoming, just on the last topic that we were talking about, it's not yet up on our website, but I think Saskia Kelders is going to be speaking. And she is also an HCD researcher from Holland who's also done a lot of work on conceptualizing engagement. So stay tuned. And Aaron, It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.